And I'd just like to lead us in a short land acknowledgement before we get started with the presentation this evening. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these treaty lands are steeped in rich Indigenous history and modern traditions. As a community, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, and ancestors. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And locating on Guelph Wellington, we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, on whose land some of us may be joining from this evening. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context, as we know that colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to be mindful of our present participation. Allies must continually engage in self-reflection and must consistently work at being an ally through learning, committing to decolonization, and sustaining relationships with Indigenous people and the land. So as you all know, this session is going to be exploring domestic violence. And for this session today, we really want to contextualize what domestic violence looks like, and particularly touching on how domestic violence has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And then towards the end, we're going to be sharing some information about Crime Stoppers and how folks can utilize Crime Stoppers around reporting around domestic violence. So just a little bit of an overview, which I just let you folks know, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end. But if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can get to them at the end as well. So as you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll be sure to address that later on. So in terms of what domestic violence is a serious crime. It's any use of physical or sexual force, actual or threatened, by a partner or a former partner. And it's important to note that domestic violence can happen to anyone, regardless of age, race, socioeconomic status, level of education, and social location. And domestic violence is primarily committed by men towards women. However, domestic violence can be committed by women towards men and can also occur in same-sex relationships. Primarily in this presentation, we'll be focusing on the impacts that domestic violence has on women, as we know that they're disproportionately impacted as victims of domestic violence. So on the screen here, you can see that domestic violence can take different forms. It can take the form of physical and sexual violence. It can take the form of verbal abuse, which can include belittling, humiliating, and intimidating. It can include psychological, and emotional abuse, as well as economic and financial abuse. And although not all of these are considered criminal offenses, these forms of abuse are all very serious. But I also like to explain domestic violence through the power and control wheel. Some of you may have seen this before. We know that domestic violence is about utilizing harm as a tool to gain power and control and to ultimately make another person feel powerless. And so this can look like using coercion and threats. So this can look like a combination of psychological and verbal abuse, such as threatening to harm pets, children, other family members, threatening to harm property, really creating real or perceived consequences for behaviors and actions. It can also look like utilizing intimidation, so utilizing fear, demonstrating physical power and force. It can also look like harassment and stalking, and we oftentimes see this as happening with past and ex-partners as well. Emotional abuse can look like putting someone down, making them feel bad about themselves, making themselves feel worthless through name calling, playing mind games, and utilizing guilt. We see isolation used as a huge tool of power and control, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later when I talk about how COVID-19 has impacted the situation. But abusers utilize isolation to create a high level of reliance on the abuser and to distance the person being abused from their support networks. So this can look like utilizing control over their digital devices, limiting where that person goes, and this can be physically limiting them through force, but also through things like taking away their car keys, controlling and attempting to control who they see or talk to, but also making them distrust the supports around them and making it seem as if they have their best interest at heart. We often see abusers minimize the situation of abuse and shift the responsibility for abuse. For those who are familiar with the term gaslighting, making it seem as if the abuse isn't happening, or it's not as bad, or the person is making it up, or overreacting to a situation. But we see oftentimes the minimization and making excuses that it won't happen again. Oftentimes as well, we see utilizing children as kind of bargaining chips and being able to gain more power and control over the family unit. And we see this a lot at Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis through our family court support program. And even in situations where an abusive relationship between partners has ended, we often see abusers continue to try to utilize children in order to maintain more power and control. Using male privilege as well, so asserting male dominance and utilizing power and control to take away empowerment of day-to-day decisions. And as I mentioned, economic and financial abuse as well. So this is also a tool to create a reliance on the abuser for basic needs to prevent access to financial means, even if she's the one earning money. So it's important to note that domestic violence, it can be a one-time use of force. However, more often than not, these crimes happen in a pattern. So they might be meant to scare, humiliate, intimidate, and ultimately, as I mentioned, make a person feel powerless. And while some of these acts may seem minor on their own, it's important to know that together they make up a pattern of abuse. And why I like the power and control wheel as well is that it kind of represents that violence is also cyclical. So there will be periods of violence and abuse where the abuse isn't constant. There may be an abusive event and then kind of a honeymoon stage of people, being strong in their relationship and someone feeling happy and at ease with their partner. But it being cyclical kind of means that there's a level of unpredictability as well of what could happen in a relationship. So I think it's really important to note that it is more often than not a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors to gain power and control over someone. So just wanted to give some folks some information about the stats, but also before I do, wanted to mention and contextualize that a lot of the statistics that we rely on around domestic violence are from police reporting, whereas we know that many folks, and there are barriers to reporting for individuals, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So wanted to contextualize that these statistics are shocking, but there's also much more domestic violence than we know goes on from what the statistics tell us. So women make up 79% of survivors of domestic violence, and 95% of spousal homicide victims in Ontario are female. Every year, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, also known as OAIF, puts out an annual femicide list. For the year 2020 in Ontario, it was estimated that 37 women and girls were killed by a man known to them in the last year. Intimate partner violence accounts for 1/3 of all incidents of violent crime reported to police in 2018. But less than 1/3 of female spousal violence report their domestic violence to police for several reasons, including fear of their spouse and partner and fear that the reporting will lead to an increase in severity of abuse, not wanting others to find out. But this also relates to the fact that many of us see domestic violence as a personal matter, and many folks want to try to deal with it in their own way. But also recognizing that many people are victimized multiple times before reporting to police as well. It's also important to note that those with intersecting marginalized identities are at a higher risk of experiencing domestic violence. So young women aged 25 to 34 experience the highest rates of domestic violence. And for Indigenous women, women with disabilities, women living in rural areas, those women also face a heightened risk of experiencing domestic violence as well. So we see with the layers of marginalization and different identities and experiences, while domestic violence can happen to anyone, it is more likely to impact certain groups. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted domestic violence. And I want to say, as someone who works in the domestic violence sector, that it's unfortunate that things have to get worse for it to kind of come to the public light. And we've seen a lot with COVID-19 that the conversation continues to enter the public eye and gain more attention to realize that this is still a serious issue. So certain parts of the country have seen a 20 to 30% increase in gender-based violence during COVID-19. And as I mentioned, the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses, they represent shelters across the province, and they represent about 70 shelters. And of those, 20% of those have reported a higher amount of crisis calls during the pandemic. And so why is this the case? So research has shown that during times of crises such as natural disasters and pandemics, gender-based violence, and in particular, domestic and sexual violence, increases in both frequency and severity. So not only are we seeing more of it, but we're seeing it become worse. 1 in 10 Canadian women have reported being very or extremely concerned about being abused at home, according to Statistics Canada. And so while isolating at home has been the primary advice given to everyone to stop the spread of COVID-19 and to maintain safety, this has really brought the conversation to light that home is not always a safe place for everyone, and to think of home as a safe place is a privilege that many of us have realized, particularly for those who are living with abusers. And so this has increased for a multitude of reasons, such as the pandemic has increased isolation from supports, whether those supports be formal or informal. So by informal supports, I mean, the ability to access seeing a friend or a family member and staying with a friend or family member, but has also increased isolation from formal supports, such as Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, such as victim services, supports that could normally, be accessed readily available in person, have now moved online, and there's an increased amount of barriers that come with accessing online supports, in particular for those who are living with abusers who may not have a lot of time to safely attend and privately attend an appointment with a counselor, safely and privately and confidentially make a crisis phone call. And so we know that the issue is out there, but we also are scared that there's lots of folks who might not be able to reach out for help right now, and that's something that's been weighing really heavily on all of us. And even informal supports that folks wouldn't normally think of as a support, such as a library, any safe and open space for folks to go. We also see while economic and job losses aren't the #1 reason behind domestic violence, we know that when there's increased stress within the home, there could be increased domestic violence. And we've seen, as we all know, many job losses, many losses of income. It could be losses of housing as well that have been the result of the pandemic, which has led to making all of our living situations worse, and a reliance of unhealthy coping mechanisms and household stress increasing. And so for many, they're heightening the feeling of being in crisis because we're dealing with many crises at once, whether that's mental health crises, addictions crises, pandemic fatigue, job losses. Many of these things are now making domestic violence worse and by making the crisis worse because it's multiple layered crises that are intersecting. And it's also important to note that pre-pandemic, violence against women organizations and organizations that support survivors are already working at full capacity and working beyond their means to address the need that's there in the community. And so I think that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing issues of needing to have more wraparound supports from the community. So for us at Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, we have had in the last year 3,000, just over 3,000 individuals call our crisis line. This is up from previous years, but not significantly. And like I said earlier, there are more barriers to being able to safely make a crisis call, which is why we're trying to develop at the moment a text service so folks can maybe get in touch with us more discreetly. And we've served over sorry, this number is incorrect on the screen, but it's just over 1,000, over 1,000 women that we've served through our various programs and services in the last year. And so recognizing again that there's barriers to access supports, which is why we're doing our best to make our online services as accessible and barrier-free as possible through providing digital devices to clients who may not have had them before, and through providing practical assistance through gift cards and trying to connect to other supports as well. We're just entering now into a program called the Phone Drive Guelph with the Community Health Center. So for folks who do have refurbished phones, used but working phones and used but working chargers, you can drop them off to our office at 38 Elizabeth Street, and those phones become refurbished to give to clients to help them better able access online appointments and digital support. So I think that's something that has been the biggest challenge, is negating and making those supports as high quality and available online, but then also recognizing that there are a lot of barriers in accessing supports. So I wanted to share with you folks, unfortunately, we were supposed to have one of our counselors from the Transitional Housing and Support Program join us this evening to talk about their experiences as a frontline worker working with survivors during the pandemic. She was unfortunately not able to join us this evening, but I found this really great video, which is from some frontline domestic violence workers across the province, who in an interview talk a little bit about their experiences. So I wanted to play that video for you folks. It's about 10 minutes long, and then wanted to talk about it with you folks at the end. So I'm just going to pull that up now.
Maybe I could get you to start here. When did you first realize that this pandemic might lead to a spike in domestic violence?
We started seeing an influx of calls probably about a month ago, and the conversations that we were having on the phone spoke a lot about the fear and the panic that a lot of families were having. We were hearing a lot of stories about isolation and the further power and control tactics that abusers were using to make the families more afraid. We were hearing about abusers who were withholding health cards or withholding access to the radio and to the news, withholding access to their children, withholding soaps and sanitizers, and all of the things that keep families safe. So we've seen it, and the influx has just continued.
Pamela, I wonder whether once you heard the order from our political leaders that they essentially wanted us all to shelter at home, did you anticipate that there would be a spike in problems?
Certainly we did, because we know that while domestic violence isn't caused by stress or financial hardship, certainly those factors contribute to the extent, to the seriousness of the abuse. We also knew that if women were going to be, as they have been, required to stay at home, initially, this was because children weren't going to school anymore. And then as public spaces started to close down, that those women really, even if they weren't at the point of being ready to move into a shelter, were going to have fewer and fewer opportunities to spend even a couple of hours a day out of the company of their abuser. And we knew that that too would contribute to a spike.
Sylvia, how about you? Have you seen a spike in calls?
Yes, we have, and our shelter at this point is totally full. We have 10 women and 18 children with us, and what we're seeing is that there's been a spike provincially by 25%, and unfortunately there's no place to go. So I think we're definitely seeing the fact that also women can't phone anymore from home in their privacy. Maybe their partner might have gone to work, so they're at home with the abusive partner, they're home with the children, and really have not even a safe place to be able to call to seek help.
In which case, what do?
So what a lot of our work, our crisis line is open 24/7. We have an outreach program also where staff are doing a lot of safety planning over the phone, telling women if things get, if your life is in danger, you need to call 911, but trying really hard to work with them in terms of safety planning, in terms of how to ensure that they can keep safe. What we're also finding is a lot of women are calling because of sort of more prolonged phone calls just about how to keep this going, and really feeling very, as everyone else said on the call, that the home has not been a safe place for them. So trying to figure out how do they keep safe. So it's a devastating situation for our staff, for the women who call, in terms of trying to figure out what to do next.
Katie, we obviously don't want to invade anybody's privacy here, but if you could give our viewers just some idea of the nature of the calls that you're getting. When people do call, what do they say?
They want to come. They want a safe space to go. For us, we have a 24-bed shelter. We are utilizing a lot of motels with kitchenettes to encourage distancing. But a lot of the times what we're doing is like what's already mentioned, is we're furthering the safety planning. We are committed to making sure that the risk assessment tools that we're using are really powerful and really capturing what's happening in the home at the time, and trying to really elaborate the different practices that they could utilize to keep themselves safe in the home, because a lot of that is looking at staying safe and not going into the bathroom, or not going into the kitchen, and not going into places where there's more weapons when an assault could happen.
And Pamela, how about you? Can you give us a sense of what you're hearing on the phones?
The work that we do at Luke's Place is a little bit different than the work that my colleagues have mentioned. We're not a shelter. We provide support to women who are making their way through the family court process, often after they've left the home. So what we've seen is a spike in calls from women who are having very different legal challenges than they have had in the past. For instance, part of the government's response to trying to isolate the virus, trying to slow down its spread, and these are good moves to make, are to do things like make it easier for people who've been charged criminally to be released on bail, and to release some people earlier from a jail or prison sentence that they may have been serving. So this has an impact on the women we serve when the partner has been arrested and charged with an incident related to abuse in the home. He may be getting out on bail in a situation where in the past he wasn't. He's now coming back into the family home because nobody's got anywhere else to go. What we're also seeing are the ways, and none of this comes as a surprise to us, I'm sorry to say, but we're seeing an increase in calls from women whose partners are intentionally using the crisis as a way to manipulate their access with the children. For instance, we had a call in the very first week from a woman who reported to us that for a number of years now, she and her ex have been exchanging the children at the local police station because that was the way for her to feel safe to do that. And he just unilaterally said, nope, not going to do that anymore. If you want the kids, he had the children. If you want the children back, you have to come to my apartment to get them. So those new issues, coupled with the fact that family courts have now suspended regular operation and are only hearing matters on an urgent basis, that the legal advice that used to be available through duty counsel at family court is not available there at the present time, have contributed not just to an increase in the needs of women at this stage in their departure from an abusive relationship, but also to a significant change in what their needs are.
Can I just do a quick follow-up on that? In the example you just gave, what recourse does the woman have whose ex-husband doesn't want to meet at the police station anymore, but insists that she come to his home to pick up the kids?
In the moment, certainly, we would be doing safety planning with her to encourage her not to put herself in a situation like that would be unsafe, even if it means delaying the return of the children by some hours or days. However, in terms of what she can do legally, we have been very, very encouraged by how responsive the judiciary have been to understanding that domestic violence is by definition an urgent situation. And so we would be supporting that woman to then bring an urgent motion in the family court in her community so that she can have a judge issue an order, and they're doing these by telephone sometimes, by Zoom conference sometimes. You know, the courts are finally going to be pushed into a modernization that should have happened long ago. So hopefully within a day, she would have an order that's enforceable immediately to have the children returned to her. It would be my hope that in that situation, the judge might also set further limits on future access because of the way the abuser behaved at the beginning of the process.
Okay. Katie, let me pursue this angle with you. Our other two guests obviously are in Southern Ontario and represent much more densely populated parts of the province. You're in Thunder Bay, which is, fairly sparsely populated to begin with, but I presume you also serve surrounding communities where, the only way to get there is to fly in. Is that right? Do you serve them as well?
Yes, we have a catchment area that includes a lot of Northwestern Ontario, and a struggle that we have right now is safety planning with families who are in remote communities. It's always been a challenge to work with families who are in smaller communities because your sister could be working at the nursing station or somebody knows somebody. So often there's privacy issues that people have when they're disclosing what's happening in the home. So a lot of it is creativity. A lot of it is having those connections with other workers and other agencies, and making sure that we are expressing the best we can to make sure that these families are safe. A lot of it too is exploring the motives of the abusers. There's some motives that we look at that really kind of help us navigate the safety plans that we're going to be using, whether the abusers are sadistic based or entitlement based or survival based. It really kind of depends on how we respond in terms of location with the abuse or with the caller.
And if you have to let's say you have to respond to an emergency in a fly-in community, has the nature of doing that changed at all now that we're into a new era of COVID-19?
Oh, absolutely, because there's a lot of, there's already challenges when it comes with transportation and bringing people in. So there are some communities where people are locked down, where they're not able to access the services that they would normally use. So like I said, a lot of it comes to being creative with the community, having a lot of workers who are familiar with the communities, and making sure that the families really understand what the options are for them so they can make informed choices when they're deciding to leave.
Sylvia, we do remember, I guess it was last week, that the Premier of Ontario released a list with some 70 plus organizations, businesses, institutions in the province that were considered essential services. I presume you're on it, but I don't know for sure. So is your organization on it?
Yes, so we are on that list. We are considered essential services. We do offer a 24-hour, 7 days a week crisis line, and our staff are in 24 hours a day working with the women and children who are living with us in the shelters.
Okay. Can you tell us whether or not you are able, given the COVID crisis we're all experiencing now, are you still able to provide the same amount of services that you could before this all happened?
No, not at all. We, with the whole issue around social distancing, lots of times we have groups, we have programming with all the women, or we have children's programming that has totally been eliminated. So one of the issues when women do come into shelter, they feel a great deal of camaraderie with others, and that's not happening at all because we no longer have any groups with women. We are doing individual counseling. That still continues on, and we're very committed to that. But the group settings or the group meals together, the sharing of stories, that's no longer a possibility because of the social distancing.
All right, so I'm just gonna stop it there, and I wanted to kind of, before I turn it over to Sarah, talk a little bit about. Let me just get my PowerPoint here. All right, so what were some of those the highlights that came out of the video? For me, speaking with our counselors and workers at the shelter, I thought that there was a lot of themes that have come through from what we've been hearing at our agency as well. Utilizing the fear of the pandemic as a weapon has been a big one. So withholding news, withholding PPE, and again, this kind of ties back into that isolation, that power and control, and utilizing the fear of the pandemic. As well, some of the folks mentioned that there's been a high focus on safety planning, and particularly safety planning within the context of the home. So I wanted to highlight one of the programs and services that we offer at Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis, which is the Transition and Housing Support Program. And this is for women who have been or are in abusive relationships or have recently left an abusive relationship. But I also wanted to highlight that you don't have to leave a relationship to seek supports, and that part of the safety planning that we can do for folks is for folks who are currently living with their abusers as well, and trying to make sure that they are as safe as possible. As well, mentioning challenges with the family court support program and different legal challenges that they've had in the past, such as releasing those charged on bail and using the crisis as a way to manipulate children. One of the things that one of the women mentioned as well was challenges with transportation. And I think that's something that we've seen, particularly for those in Wellington County who may not be able to access as easily supports that are based in Guelph. Recognizing that, you know, we are an essential service as well, but with our shelter, we've been operating at a reduced capacity. And one of the things that the woman mentioned at the end was that sense of camaraderie that women get from sharing stories and experiences and feeling as if they're in solidarity with one another. We've just started offering some online groups again. So that's one way that we're trying to continue to build the relationship amongst survivors. But I think not having that and increasing that isolation has been a big one as well. Some of the other programs and services that are available through the Transition and Housing Support Program are individual and group counseling. As I mentioned, group counseling is just starting online. Safety and transition plannings, helping prepare for legal proceedings, and helping with the completion of forms. Oh, can folks still hear me? Okay, I just got a message from the chat that my audio wasn't working. So if folks can hear me, that's okay, but let me know if there's any trouble with that. And for our next session as well, for folks who will be joining, we'll be talking more in-depthly about the services that are available with Women in Crisis, as well with Victim Services Wellington and the OPP as well as a resource. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about the work that Crime Stoppers does.
Thank you, Jensen. Just to preface this part of the presentation, Crime Stoppers has seen a sustained level of tip intake over COVID, which I think is a good indication. It means people remember Crime Stoppers when they see or hear about criminal activity. And it ties in so well with the topic today that obviously there are people who would know or could know about domestic violence, either witnessing it or interaction with the victim or the abuser, and knowing that this is happening and can actually do something about that crime as a result. So what Crime Stoppers really stands for is an intermediary. We are the middleman between the tipster and the police. We are not a police organization. And our fundamental belief is that someone other than the criminal has information that can solve a crime, and no tip is too small. So using domestic violence as an example, you might have a limited amount of information regarding a situation, but it's so important to come forward because you could actually be saving someone from a prolonged existence of abuse. And as Jensen has already pointed out, you could literally be saving someone's life and those of their children, depending on the circumstances. So we encourage people to reach out to us. As you can see there, our phone number is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's 1-800-222-TIPS, which is 8477. We also have a web tip option, which I'm sure we're going to see in a moment. But this is just to give you a little introduction to what Crime Stoppers is about and why we feel so strongly about partnering on this topic, so that people know there is something that can be done, especially during a challenging time like a global pandemic. Thanks, Jensen. We don't talk about the specific cases that we're responsible for helping solve, and that is done specifically to protect our tipsters. Our tipsters are anonymous. This means that we do not know who they are, we do not know where they live, we don't know their relationship to the criminal activity, and we frankly don't care. What is the most important part to us is that they have information that can solve a crime. But the way that you know that Crime Stoppers is effective is through our stats, okay? So going through from our time of incorporation in 1988 through to the end of January of this year, We've had over 22,000 tips to our program, and that ranges everything from human trafficking, break and enter, drug tips, right through. Yes, we actually have had tips on domestic violence, and we're very thankful for those tips. We've had over 1,500 arrests as a result of the information provided to us by our tipsters. And to give you an example, we've been able to resolve 723 drug occurrences as a result. We've recovered more than $37 million in drugs, personal property, and cash. Of course, we can't put a dollar value on a human life. So while this only refers to material items, you can imagine a successful domestic violence tip is priceless. Over 4,300 charges have been laid as a result of the information provided to Crime Stoppers, which is then forwarded to our police partners. We've had over 2,200 cases cleared as a result of the information, and our board of directors have approved rewards in excess of $173,000. With a successful tip, you are qualifying for a cash reward, and not everyone who calls Crime Stoppers is interested in a reward. But for those who are, that is how the program was designed in the beginning. And we honor that agreement that if your information leads to an arrest, you qualify for the cash reward. Thanks, Jensen. We too were impacted with the global pandemic. Hard to believe it's almost been a year, but we immediately transitioned to remote work, which has been a seamless transition for us. We're very proud of the fact that we did not miss a day and we did not miss a tip from our regular office environment to our remote work setup. We are focusing on community engagement, just like we have this evening, and we've pivoted to online presentations, obviously, because we're here today. We really appreciate the opportunity to partner, and in some cases, this is an opportunity that would not have presented itself otherwise, so we're very appreciative to Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis for this opportunity. But to everyone who's maybe questioning, rest assured, we have the same anonymity with our program, regardless of how we are structured now, and the same confidentiality. The only people who are aware of a tip to Crime Stoppers are the individuals here at Crime Stoppers who take the tip, and then it is forwarded to our police partners. But again, there is no way to identify who the tipster is. Okay, thank you, Jensen. If you're wanting to learn a little more about Crime Stoppers outside of what we're discussing tonight, I would invite you to check out our social media presence. We're active on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and of course, our website at www.csgw.tips, which is also another way that you are able to provide a tip to our program. Okay. A common misconception, aside from people thinking that we are the police, we're not, is that we're a business. We're actually a not-for-profit charitable organization that relies on donations, from private citizens, organizations, local businesses, and of course our fundraising activities. Naturally, this year that has been somewhat impacted because of the pandemic, but all rewards paid by Crime Stoppers are paid for through fundraising, not tax dollars. That seems to be something that people think, that we get some kind of government funding that covers the cost of our rewards. That's not the case. All money required to support our program must be raised through individual and corporate support, for which we're most thankful. Thank you, Jensen. We are structured with a board of directors, and these are individuals from the community who are invested and want to volunteer and give back to their individual communities as a whole. We have monthly meetings. We're actually going to be having a board meeting tomorrow night. These board members are crucial for maintaining our partnerships with Wellington County OPP as well as Guelph Police Service. They are the individuals who approve the reward amounts to go to our tipsters. They raise the funds that pay the rewards, and they help increase public awareness by promoting the program through their individual network of contacts. Okay. We've been very fortunate to be recognized both provincially and internationally. And the reason we share this screen is to assure the public that the work we're doing locally is being recognized at a higher level. So if you're providing information to Crime Stoppers Guelph Wellington, you should feel confident that you are working with an organization that is keeping you safe and anonymous, that we are effective in the work that we are doing, and we respect the communities that we work within, and it's very important to us. So we do share these awards with our media partners, with our community partners, and we're very proud to be able to bring these back home to Guelph Wellington.
I wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight. As a reminder for folks, this is part one of a two-part series that we're doing with Crime Stoppers and Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis on domestic violence realities and resources. Our next session will be this Thursday, March 11th at the same time from 7 to 8 p.m. through the same Eventbrite link that you used to register for this event. So we really look forward to having you for our second part of the series, and we hope that this first session was very informative for you folks. And for our second session on resources, we'll be highlighting some different resources available to survivors and their friends and families in the community. We'll be featuring more from Sarah and myself, as well as we'll be featuring Victim Services Wellington and two representatives from the Wellington OPP. So we do hope that you enjoyed this evening, and our contact information is on the screen for folks who might want to reach out with additional questions or requests for further resources. And I'll just turn it to Sarah to give any closing thoughts.
Thank you so much, Jensen. Yes, a lot of information, a lot to take in. I do hope people take advantage of the opportunity to reach out either to Guelph Wellington Women in Crisis or to Crime Stoppers. As you can see, the numbers are very high. We want to make that change. We want to make sure we're making a difference in our community and keeping people safe. So once again, use the contact information on the screen right now and reach out to us. And indeed, you could be saving lives.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and we hope to see you again on Thursday. Have a great night.